when I went back to MIT, I really sort of thought it makes sense to focus on the plastics, because as I read up more on plastics, it occurred to me that, plastics are really the challenge, that, we recycle like less than 10% of these plastics. And it was just sort of a surprise to me at that point, because no one was talking about plastics back then. And I had always assumed that, we recycle plastics. I didn't realize like how little actually gets recycled.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Eric Hornung, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Talking to the Camera himself, Jay Klaus. Jay, how's it going, man?
Which camera are we talking about?
I'm talking about the camera that you seem to be talking to in a lot of your recent social media posts. You're telling some stories, you're talking to a camera, it's just you and your apartment in a scene that I am very familiar with, but I'm sure that other people are not.
I am running an experiment. I am doubling down on content marketing, which is a lot of writing behind the scenes and a lot of social media in front of the scenes. But I have a client right now who focuses on social and content, and he kind of gave me a checklist or a guideline of some things to try out and see if it works and see how it does on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, some of this video content, which I don't love doing, but pro tip, the app Vlog Easy is awesome.
Wow, do we get paid for this?
We should send it over to them. Actually, when I first came across Vlog Easy, the first thing I did was email their support line and say, whatever technology you're using for this, you should deploy that for podcasters because it cuts out like all the dead space. And as much as it's great for video, like it's also good for audio, I would think.
Is that how you get the like choppy video look?
It does automatic jump cuts.
Wow, I was wondering how you did that.
It looks pretty good, right?
Yeah, it looks like you hired someone to do like the classic YouTube vlogger style.
I literally hit a record button, I talk to the camera, and it identifies and creates the jump cuts all on its own. And it's very accurate. Sometimes I have to fix it a little bit, but it does a really good job of it. So it makes it really easy to do more stuff on camera because even when I have long pauses or am unsure of myself, cuts it right out.
You know what's kind of messed up?
What's that?
You focus so much on the background of where you record for those videos, but when you and I are recording here, I get open curtains, clothes piled up, uncleaned whiteboard. It's just, I don't get the same level of respect as the general populace.
You're right, and I apologize.
It just feels like you could, freshen up the place a little bit for me. That's all I'm saying.
Just do a little bit of cleaning up my environment here.
Yeah, you could clean up your environment, maybe throw that bottle behind you in the recycling. I don't know.
Well, what a perfect segue into our guest today, who is Priyanka Bakaya, the founder and CEO of Renewology. Renewology was founded at MIT in 2011 with the vision of being the technology leader in developing solutions to plastic waste. Through their proprietary chemical recycling process, which allows them to reverse plastic back into its basic molecular structure, they convert non-recycled plastic into new valuable products such as high-value fuels. Priyanka has been recognized by Forbes 30 Under 30, Fortune 40 Under 40 Ones to Watch, and several other awards. She's a Stanford and MIT graduate, and holy crap, Eric, what an accomplished guest. How are we going to talk to this person?
I can barely talk to you, and you're like not even half as smart as she is.
Like I said, Renewology founded in 2011, based in Salt Lake City, Utah, our first Salt Lake guest. Eric, that was mean.
It was such a clever backhand. I'm like very proud of myself.
Man, you're right.
Recycling is one of those areas that I don't really know too much about. I know that there is a large problem in recycling in that, or at least I've heard rumors, in that if you throw the wrong thing in one bin, it could spoil an entire truckload of recycling because the cost to segment it and sort it is so high that I think something like 75% of all recycling just goes into a landfill anyway. So it's a broken process, and especially in the United States where the Chinese aren't buying our recyclables anymore, it's kind of running up against a macroeconomic problem.
It's so hard for me to know how to recycle, and the process and the infrastructure is just not very good. My girlfriend's been reading up a lot on it lately, and I'm taking rings off of Gatorade bottles, but throwing the Gatorade bottle itself in the recycling. I'm learning a little bit, but man, it seems pretty opaque. So I think we'll probably dig into quite a bit of that in this conversation with Priyanka, just to lay a baseline of understanding of how does the recycling practice actually work here in the United States? What's broken, what's working, and how does Renewology fit in?
So if you have any thoughts on recycling or this interview, we'd love to hear them. You can tweet at us at UpsideFM, or if you have something a little longer, send us an email at hello@upside.fm.
Eric, can you imagine being a founder working with Drive Capital, Hyde Park Venture Partners, Draper Triangle, Excel, Chicago Ventures, Refinery Ventures, Hyde Park Angels? Can you imagine being a founder and working with all of those VCs and more?
Man, if you got an investment from or worked with all of those VCs and they were giving you advice and on your board, and you just have to be probably one of the best companies in the Midwest or in between the coasts, I would say.
And that's exactly what Integrity Power Search is. Integrity Power Search works with all of those VC partners and more as the #1 full-stack, high-growth startup recruiting firm between the coasts. They partner with those venture capitalists, private equity groups, and CEOs to build amazing teams to the world's most disrupting companies. Eric, they are working with 84-plus companies in those different venture portfolios, helping fill roles related to SaaS companies, autonomous vehicle companies, big data, computer vision, blockchain. If you're looking to hire, Integrity Power Search can help.
And if you want to learn more about Integrity Power Search and what they're doing in between the coasts, you can go to upside.fm/integrity.
Priyanka, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys.
On Upside, we like to start with a background of the guest. So can you tell us about the history of Priyanka?
Sure. So my name is Priyanka Bakaya. I grew up in Australia and moved to the US for college and was always really excited about the idea of social entrepreneurship right from the time I started college. And really my career path since graduation has really always been about how to be an entrepreneur working towards social impact in some way.
When was the first time that you heard the term social entrepreneurship?
That's a great question. It was actually my first year when I was an undergrad at Stanford. It was sort of this new term, I think, that had been coined, and it just really resonated with me because I was really drawn, the reason I had chosen Stanford was I was drawn to entrepreneurship, but, more importantly, I wanted to do something really meaningful with my life, and social entrepreneurship seemed to be a way to bring those two passions together.
How did you become aware of even Stanford as an institution growing up in Australia? Why come here and why come to Stanford?
Yeah, I just remember as a child growing up in Australia and just sort of hearing stories of teenagers starting companies. Back then there was the dot-com boom, and you sort of heard about these people and they went to Stanford and somehow they were able to start these companies. So in my head, I was just like this magical place where you could become an entrepreneur at a young age, which didn't seem to be the case in Australia.
Did you start any side hustles or companies when you were in high school or earlier?
I did. I did try a few different things, nothing major, but I had, started a school magazine, and just I was always trying to start up new things, where I saw opportunities when I was in school.
Did you have sort of entrepreneurial heroes, these people that maybe went to Stanford or otherwise that you looked up to and said, that's the type of entrepreneur that I want to be?
Yeah, well, my main entrepreneurial hero is my father. He's an entrepreneur, and he had left India and really started from scratch in Australia and sort of built himself up from nothing as an entrepreneur. And he's sort of still to this day is my entrepreneurial hero because, he really started with nothing and was able to build something with zero support. So it's just always been sort of an inspiration to see his journey and what he was able to do starting with nothing, just because of his sort of passion and determination to create things.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and why he moved from India to Australia and what type of thing that he was building?
Sure. He was very much a serial entrepreneur. And so, throughout my childhood, he was always just trying lots of different things that probably don't seem very related. But his main business has been around financial research, but he really sort of dabbled in many different things over the years and was just always, coming home with new ideas. And, we'd discuss them at the dinner table. He'd always ask for my inputs, from a young age. So I think that got me thinking about entrepreneurship really early. And yeah, the reason my parents left was really just, to move to a place where they would have better opportunities for their children. But, they really moved with like zero support network in place and, had to really build themselves from, coming out of like immigrant housing in Australia to, establish themselves in the society at that time.
What is Australian society like? It's one of those places that every time I hear about Australia, I'm reminded that I want to visit, but also that I know next to nothing about. So what does growing up in Australia look like? What's the culture like? What are you taught?
It's drastically changed since I was growing up. So when my parents moved back in the early 80s, they were entering Australia right after the White Australia policy had been removed. And so Australia actually had a policy around sort of immigrants only from white countries. And so we were sort of the first wave of immigrants. Now, if you are in Australia, it's much more diverse. But back then, growing up, it was, not very diverse at all. That I think had a sort of important role in my childhood as well. But my parents always sort of made sure that I knew where I came from. We would go and, travel pretty much every year, either to India. We also had a lot of family in the US, so I got exposed to the US pretty early. Other than that, it's a great place to grow up. It's, the society is definitely less of the rat race, I guess, than the US. So, in terms of quality of life, it was and still is just sort of well-balanced society in that way.
How do you decide where to live now? You've had these experiences in 3 different continents. How do you pick somewhere to live?
It's really has to be a place that, resonates with where you are at the current moment. And for me as an entrepreneur, I mean, the US is definitely the only place I could be. When I look at the entrepreneurial ecosystem that the US has, there's just no country on the planet that comes even close to the US in terms of that. And people talk about where in the US, et cetera. But, just overall, the US starting a company is just by far the best place. And, I've now tried, Jay and I were sort of speaking briefly about the nonprofit that we've set up, Renew Oceans, and we have our first project is in India. And just, the amount of like paperwork, et cetera, to establish even a company. I mean, in the US, you can just like establish a company overnight. Like that just doesn't exist in any other part of the world. So I think we're very, very blessed in the US in terms of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So yeah, sort of coming back to your question in terms of where to choose, it does have to be somewhere that sort of resonates with where you are in life. And for me, as an entrepreneur, it sort of, has to fit in well with what I'm trying to achieve.
Last question about Australia, maybe. How much do Australians talk and think about the Great Barrier Reef versus how Americans perceive that as a part of Australia?
I guess it depends how close you are to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, because probably some Australians don't talk about it at all. But I imagine if you live right there, you might be speaking about it quite a bit.
Jay, how often do you talk and think about the Grand Canyon?
Few times a year? Yeah, good question.
Take me back to Stanford. You learn about this thing called social entrepreneurship. What's your first time dabbling in either social entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship? I'm assuming it's in college.
Yes, I was a part of two actually social entrepreneurship ventures in college. And, one of them was focused on India and creating systems that worked for like the agricultural sector. And I did, while I was in college, make a few trips to India, to conduct research, et cetera. And because I'd grown up, like always visiting India, there was definitely a part of me that always felt that I needed to give back to the country in some way. I could see that, I've been given all this opportunity in life, and I felt like part of, my responsibility to the world was to use all that opportunity that I had received to give back in some way. And, when you visit India, you see just how many people just sort of need these opportunities and have so much potential. So that's something that really sort of stuck with me from my experience at Stanford and working in social entrepreneurship and spending some time on the field in India. When I was graduating from college, I just didn't feel at that point in time that I knew enough to start my own venture coming out of college, which is why I worked for a few years. But looking back on it now and knowing sort of what it is to be an entrepreneur, I wish I had just jumped into it, because the truth is you're never really actually ready. You just sort of learn while you're doing it. So while it took me like a little bit longer because I started the company coming out of grad school, in hindsight, I would have actually just sort of jumped right into it coming out of college.
And so I'm assuming, I'm kind of reading between the lines, but it sounds like you're saying the company you wanted to start, you were already aware of it as you graduated undergrad, but just didn't feel confident enough to dive in first.
Yeah. And, sometimes I speak with young entrepreneurs who have that sort of same feeling that I did, that, I need to like learn how it all works first before jumping in. And, usually my advice is to really encourage them to jump right in. And, you'll probably fail a lot, but that's fine. That's sort of part of the journey. And we just have to become comfortable with that failure.
So is that idea that you're interested in, did that become Renewology?
It's sort of become it's in different ways. I had many different interests. So the environment's always been like a strong interest of mine. Women's empowerment issues have always been sort of an interest of mine. And then doing something for India was also an interest. And in my journey of Renewology and the new nonprofit Renew Oceans, I've sort of tried to bring all of those out in some way through this journey.
So what is Renewology today, in your own words?
Sure. So our focus at Renewology is to really focus on creating circular economies for plastics. So currently the challenge with plastics is that we recycle less than 10% of all plastic in the US. And that's because of sort of various challenges in the collection and end of market for most plastics. And so what we've developed at Renewology is a technology that goes beyond what can be done through mechanical recycling, where we actually chemically recycle the plastics back to their basic building blocks to be able to make new products out of them. And that's really our mission at Renewology, is to increase the recycling rates and be able to convert more of these plastics that are out there into new products so that they don't end up in the environment and landfills.
I want to come back to this soon, but it seems like to fully grasp what Renewology is doing, I want to make sure we're all on the same page of how recycling works today or worked before Renewology. Because recently, my girlfriend's taken a strong interest in recycling, and I've learned a lot that I had no idea that I was doing wrong, that apparently just like could be ruining whole batches of things that are trying to be recycled. So can you give us a brief history or explanation of how recycling works in the US today?
Sure. So basically, if you live in a big city, you probably have access to recycling, and that might be you have a blue bin, which is for your mixed recyclables, and then your regular trash can, which is sort of everything that goes to the landfill. If you're in certain communities, you might have some special other bins, whether that be something for composting or something for glass recycling, etc. But primarily there's two bins. In that mixed recycling bin, the blue bin, you are meant to be putting in anything like paper, cardboard, metals, plastics, and that is taken to a material recovery facility. It's sort of known as a MRF for short. And at that facility, they basically separate all those materials into different grades. So the cardboard is sold, the aluminum cans are sold, and it goes through a lot of sorting equipment. There is some, manual pulling out that happens. With the plastics, what tends to happen is they are trying to pull out the high value plastic. So it's things like water bottles, milk bottles, in terms of the plastic numbers, in case you sort of ever look at the bottom of plastics, it's things like number 1 plastics, number 2 plastics. Those are very commonly recycled. And then what tends to happen is there's this pile of low value plastics that are known as these numbers 3 through 7. And it can be various numbers that are in there, but it's sort of these lower grade plastics, which are mixed. And those used to be sent to China very commonly until China stopped accepting our low value plastics. And so now the end markets for those plastics have become a little bit more challenging in this country for these things like the 3 through 7s.
Man, so many questions here. So I have these blue bins behind my apartment. What happens if I throw non-recyclable stuff in those blue bins?
Yeah, so that becomes very challenging for recyclers to handle because, they, in order to make the economics work, they really want to keep contamination low. And so the more contamination they have, the less economic this process is. And then, the less sustainable that business model is for them. So, some of these recyclers might experience anywhere from like 20% contamination to 30%. Sometimes we've even seen recyclers who have more. And you can imagine just, how challenging it is when so much of your stream is contaminated in that way.
And to what degree does something have to be wrong to be considered contamination? Because I've even been told that sometimes rings on a Gatorade bottle that are part of the cap are not recyclable, but the rest of the bottle is. Like, how much do I need to really know about recycling to be a helpful recycler as, an end customer of some of these products?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the rings, that's not like really like contamination. I think for them, the contamination is definitely anything that's organic. Sometimes people are putting food there, or things might be still covered in food or like filled with liquid, for instance. Like that's sort of like a very sort of clear example of contamination, something that they wouldn't want to see in that stream. Even like diapers, like people for some reason think like diapers can be recycled, which is pretty much every recycler sees diapers. So things like that.
That sounds like textbook contamination.
Yeah, definitely.
I am so sorry. I'm in the middle of kind of a fire drill.
I think we can hear
it. So every lawyer on our team is calling me right now. So I have to run, and I am so apologetic. I am the worst possible podcast host there's ever been, I think.
That's okay. We'll let Jay handle it.
I'm sorry, guys.
All right. So that scratches a lot of my itch of understanding how recycling works today. Talk to me about the impetus of Renewology, because you said you've always had a little bit of an interest in clean tech or circular economies. How did you come to the solution of Renewology?
It was definitely like a few different things that led me there. So one initial inspiration was growing up. We had a family friend. His name was Percy Keane, and he was an elderly Australian man who had fought in the wars. He'd sort of stayed a bachelor his whole life, and so we'd sort of adopted him as kind of this honorary grandfather figure in our family. And he was a chemist and basically had sort of converted his home into this giant chemistry lab. And I was always just very fascinated by all the strange things he was developing. One of those things was actually plastics, which he'd converted into fuels. And so I still remember him showing me some fuel which he had made and holding up a match to it and it lighting. And I thought it was really cool. Obviously at that age, I didn't really understand anything about the process or what he was doing, but it definitely sort of intrigued me. And I was always really interested in science and innovation. So later when, I was in college and grad school, I sort of, thought back to what he had developed. Unfortunately, by that point, he had passed away in his 90s, but it really sort of got me thinking about, what if he had opportunities to take things beyond just like his little lab, what could have been there. So that sort of spurred my interest in this sort of idea of like clean energy and what might be possible. And then when I was at MIT, I did start working on a business plan around electronic waste. At that time, I saw sort of a huge challenge around, the amount of electronics that everyone was consuming, and they're not really being like a good end of life. And I went and spent a summer actually in India while I was at MIT working at an electronic waste startup there that was trying to solve these issues. And it really opened my eyes to what was happening on the ground. I had an opportunity to actually see some waste pickers like sorting through this material. And that experience really stuck with me because what I saw was it wasn't so much electronic waste that was the issue, it was actually plastic, because they were pulling out the metals, which had a lot of value, and then the plastics were sort of being left and either being dumped in the environment or openly burned. And it was just sort of a really eye-opening experience. And when I went back to MIT, I really sort of thought it makes sense to focus on the plastics, because as I read up more on plastics, it occurred to me that, plastics are really the challenge, that, we recycle like less than 10% of these plastics. And it was just sort of a surprise to me at that point because no one was talking about plastics back then. And I had always assumed that, we recycle plastics. I didn't realize like how little actually gets recycled.
What is it about plastics that makes it so problematic for recycling?
So basically, in order to mechanically recycle something, you have to have just a segregated type of plastic. So it needs to be just one type of plastic. And because there's so many different types of plastics, that's what becomes challenging, just having like that one segregated pile of that plastic, because obviously there's a cost at the end of the plastic's life to collect the material and then, actually segregated back into the right plastic type, which makes it a bit more challenging than some other materials such as cardboard and paper and aluminum cans, etc., which are just sort of a little bit more straightforward to collect and segregate into piles.
Why do we have 7 different types of plastics?
So they all have specific material qualities that the others don't. And, part of why, we've advanced so much on different technologies over the past few decades has been because of these properties that plastic have. So, I was at a air and space museum exhibit over the weekend, and it's just like all of that, just like space exploration would not have been possible without plastic. It's just everywhere. We would just simply would not have been able to go to space without plastic. Similarly, in the medical sphere, so much of what we've developed there just wouldn't have been possible without plastic. Similarly, with like transporting food, the spoilage there would have been an issue without plastic. So it has given us, I ask myself the same question, can't we just like make it more simple? But the truth is like so much of what we now enjoy as a society and like the progress we've had technologically has been because of these different materials, that have come into our society. So, really sort of as I looked at it, it wasn't so much that, okay, we just need to get rid of these materials. Like we just really have to design these materials thinking about the end of life and figuring out, what does that end of life look like? And, perhaps if there is no end of life for some materials, maybe then focus on those. But, let's try to use technology to really create an end of life for as many of these materials as we can.
So one last kind of background context question. As you've really studied this and you've asked yourself why so many types of plastics, and you see like, okay, well, it's been necessary for our progress to this point. Is there any like sector or industry or bad actor that puts us in this, crisis situation we hear all about with the oceans, which I'm sure we'll talk about Renew Oceans here shortly? Is there any one party that is really driving a problem, or is it just one of these wicked problems that you can't have the good that we have without the bad?
Yeah, no, I don't think you can point your finger at one specific person. I think at the end of the day, as consumers, we also demand these products. At the end of the day, a lot of responsibility falls on us as well. Plastic has given us a far more convenient lifestyle, and we would definitely have to do away with a lot of conveniences if we were to, move back to a society pre-plastic. And people like to sort of finger point like one industry or, one sector, et cetera. But I think this is just sort of a collective issue. I think, one thing that I've tried to focus on is, maybe there are specific plastics that even with all the advances in various chemical recycling technologies, that even these technologies can't solve. And maybe those are, where we need to kind of focus on some of the redesign questions. But just sort of these sort of overarching bans to just sort of overnight ban all plastics, I don't think is very sensible, because the alternatives are probably less sustainable anyway. Like moving to glass or other materials, like just wouldn't be a very sustainable outcome.
So how does the Renewology product or process work?
Sure. So what we're doing is basically reversing the process from which plastic was created. So plastic essentially comes from hydrocarbons, from, non-condensable gas and light fuels to begin with. And so what we do is we are reversing that process that made the plastic and basically taking it back to its building blocks, which is basically down to that small molecule, whether it's like the light fuels or those non-condensable gases. And from there, that material can either be sent back into a petrochemical facility to be made into new plastics or sold as some kind of energy product.
At what point do you receive plastics? How does the plastic get from its previously like bad end state of a landfill to Renewology?
Yeah, so what we do is we co-locate at either one of these material recovery facilities I was speaking to you about, or someone else who may have a lot of plastic waste on site. And so that what that does is it makes sure that we don't have to transport the plastic long distances. It makes sense for us to co-locate right there where that large quantity of plastic waste is to begin with.
What does this manifest or look like? Like I kind of just see this magical big cylindrical room that you shove the plastics into and out comes like a gas or something, but I'm sure that's not it. How does this actually manifest?
It's kind of like that. But yeah, basically the process is about the size of a tennis court. So it really is kind of like a room about the size of a tennis court. Then there's obviously like a lot of outdoor space needed for the storage of the various products, but it's a modular system. It can be co-located easily. It doesn't really take up that much space, and it's an automated process. So you have, a separate control room where you're monitoring all of the, various temperatures and pressures that this process goes through in order to make these end products.
Why isn't this everywhere right now?
There's been a number of challenges with the scale up. I guess one of the biggest has been just around like permitting. So every time we set up a facility, it's very challenging because since it's a new technology, there's not really any good existing regulatory framework that we fit under. And so we often will get mischaracterized as something we're not, like incineration, for instance, which is a very different process where you're burning plastics. It's a much larger process and has, large emissions associated with it. So either we might be put into that bucket or we might actually be put into like a waste processing bucket. So they tried to make us a waste processor, which we're not. And so it ends up being very challenging. Every time we need to get a permit takes, a little bit of time. We're now working, with groups to try to push the regulation on a state-by-state basis across the US. But that has been something that has been challenging just on the regulatory side. And then, when you have those regulatory challenges, then other things become challenging, like financing the project, because, people don't like to finance things where there's regulatory risk. So there's, continues to be a number of challenges just sort of getting these facilities up and running. So it's not as easy as just sort of saying, hey, like we have this great technology, let's build 100. It is very much, we have to do sort of one facility at a time and get the approvals. And so it ends up taking longer than, we wish it would take.
I have so many questions because now like there's just so many systemic issues here that I'm like, wow, why? Like this is such a big problem. And if this works. So how indisputable are the results here? Can you take everything that's going into some of these facilities that's previously not recycled and say like, whoosh, in our machine, out of our process, and now like we don't have that problem? Like in a theoretical world where regulatory wasn't an issue, what does that mean for
our country, our planet, if the Renewology process is all over?
Yeah, I mean, there's just huge potential in terms of, the amount of plastic and then just the end product. And, now the great thing is that petrochemical companies really are very interested in telling this story of closing the loop and, taking our end products and making new plastics out of that. So there's really a robust supply chain there that is available. And so I think there will be a lot of growth in this area in the coming years. And I think it's just really a matter of getting through some of these regulatory challenges. There definitely needs to be an improvement in the collection infrastructure in the US as well. So, we're only collecting just a small fraction of the plastic that's being generated as a country. And that's because a lot of the country doesn't necessarily have access to recycling, or even if they have access to recycling, they might not recycle. So there's a huge untapped market there to really capture more plastics out of the stream, because we only get the plastics that people have put into that, recycling stream. Whatever people put into their regular landfill bound stream, we never see. And there is huge quantities there as well, which, we need to capture over time as well.
How big of an issue at these material recovery facilities, how big of an issue is contamination in your guys' process?
So fortunately for us, we are able to handle higher level contaminations than a regular recycler. Basically, whatever doesn't become like some kind of petrochemical product from our process comes out as a inert char byproduct. And so that allows us to really, be able to handle the contamination at a higher level than sort of a traditional mechanical recycler can. I mean, obviously, nobody likes contamination, but at least sort of our process can handle that without it sort of destroying the process in any way.
What types of inputs, you mentioned like pressure at one point, what types of inputs go into this Renewology system to create these petrochemical outputs?
At a high level, it's really just the plastic that is going into the process. The energy to heat the process initially comes from natural gas, but once the process is going, it actually just comes from the plastic itself, because the plastic generates non-condensable gas. So the plastic is actually, a certain amount of the plastic, like 10 to 15% of that plastic is actually driving the energy that's required for the process. So in that way, it's a very self-sufficient process where you're not really adding or removing anything. You're just sort of changing the state of the plastic, which is really neat.
What's the model here? Who's the customer of this?
There's a few different ways when we set up the facility on how we do it. So either we might sell it to the waste company and just do a sales and licensing agreement, or we might do some kind of joint venture where we're also part of the owner. So those are sort of like some of the different ways the business model works. And the customer might be that waste company, or it might be, someone else who's interested in being like a joint venture partner.
So if I'm the waste management company, or, I'm in this joint venture with you, are you saying that the proceeds from the petrochemical output is worth more than the cost to actually operate the system?
Definitely. Yeah, that's right.
And so you guys are really at this just scaling phase, and the challenge is cash flow, it sounds like, and regulatory, but like even getting through the regulatory time probably just takes, I'm assuming, like cash to keep operating.
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. Basically, we're at a point where the technology is, ready to be scaled and deployed in different places. And, there's a lot of interest to set up lots of facilities like overnight. And it's just sort of more of a getting through all of, each state by state, or, some of these will be international projects, like just getting through the various like regulatory hurdles in each of those places, before these facilities can come online.
I saw you have a Salt Lake City facility that is in partnership with government and private sector through grants, awards, et cetera. That was on your website. How many facilities in total do you guys have up and running now?
Yeah, so we have the Salt Lake City facility, and then we have another one that we deployed in Nova Scotia, Canada, and we're working on a third one right now with the city of Phoenix in Arizona, where that'll be like located at their material recovery facility there in Phoenix. So that's our next one. And then we have a few more in the pipeline, but sort of like I said, sort of it's a matter of getting through sort of all the regulatory and paperwork in each of those locations.
I'm guessing this is probably an issue that, at least at a federal level, there's probably like cross the aisle collaboration here, right? I think everyone would agree that we need some more sustainability. Or maybe I'm wrong. Have you guys experienced that this is a bipartisan issue?
Definitely the ocean plastics seems to be, which is really great to see that. In terms of the regulation I'm speaking about, that's very much like a state level, falls under the state level jurisdiction. But it's been great to just see in terms of this ocean plastic issue that it is very much a bipartisan topic.
Can you talk about Renew Oceans and where that came from?
Sure, yeah. So Renew Oceans is just under a year old, and basically I wanted to see how our Renewology technology could address this challenge of plastic pollution in the oceans. As I was thinking about this last year, there had been a great paper that had just come out sort of detailing that over 90% of the plastic waste entering the ocean from rivers came from these 10 key rivers. So in my head, I thought, what if we just really focused on, instead of going into the ocean and, taking the plastics out of the ocean, what if we really focused on these 10 key rivers, since they seem to be like a big source of these plastics which are entering the ocean. And we decided to launch on one of those 10 rivers, the Ganges, which is the most populous and the number 2 most polluting in terms of plastics. And so basically the idea there is to set up these kind of fence-like structures in the rivers to prevent the plastics from going downstream and capture the plastics there where they still might have some value and be able to be either recycled or converted into fuels using the Renewology process. And over time, the hope is that as these communities see the value in plastics, that less of them would sort of enter the river to begin with.
So what is the state of that experiment at this point?
The pilot is underway right now in India, in Varanasi, which is right there along the Ganges. And we are on target this year for diverting 100,000 pounds of material from, it's one of the major tributaries that goes into the Ganges. So it is very exciting to see that project kind of come to life and to get some really good data in our first pilot year of that project, as we look to sort of also scale that in other parts of India and the region. Basically, over 80% of this plastic waste that's entering the oceans comes from Asia. So that's really our focus through Renew Oceans.
So you have these fence structures set up capturing this waste. Where does it have to go from there? Are you is the pilot co-locating with another, you said, is materials recovery facility there?
Yeah, so the challenge in places like India is there is real lack of waste management infrastructure in place. And so what we find is we have to set up some of that infrastructure ourselves. So we've been setting up what we call the Renew Shed. It's basically a place to take these plastics and sort them into a stream that can either be recycled or converted to fuel, while sort of engaging with that local community of, it's primarily waste pickers who engage in this work there.
Is that in partnership with any other type of government or private entity? I'm sure that comes with its own big set of costs as well to create these centers and create the infrastructure.
Yeah, so we've definitely had to get, a lot of approvals at the government level. We've decided not to partner with a specific entity because it can get a little bit complicated working in India, sort of knowing who that other party is. So we've been acting as an independent organization, but obviously working to get all those approvals in place on the ground.
What am I not asking here that I should be asking or that I'm missing?
I guess really what excites me is just sort of like the big picture and potential of these technologies as we look out 5-10 years. And, I think right now there is some debate in the industry where you have some people on one side saying ban all plastics, and then, others saying, no, plastics in and of themselves aren't evil. We just need to create circular economies around plastics. So that is something that is an interesting conversation. And, now even sort of as I speak to like regular people, there is some of the sentiment that I hear that, just plastics are evil and should be banned. And so it's an interesting conversation I find myself having, which I wasn't having definitely up until this year. So it's an interesting one.
As an individual, like, what is the best thing that I can do to be a good steward? Because like you said, even the infrastructure here in the United States just doesn't seem great. Like, it's not easy for me to recycle as an individual by any means. So what would you say is like your short list of recommendations that regular everyday Joes like me can do to make a difference?
Yeah, it really goes back to the 3 R's. So reduce, reuse, recycle. And so, for me, when I purchase something, first is like, the question is, do you need this product? And that's where reducing comes in. Then there's reusing. So, wherever possible, try to reuse that item so that it doesn't just have sort of one short life. And then when you do buy items, what I try to check is it actually something that can be recycled? Now, this is a tricky one because nobody understands recycling infrastructure as well as I do. So it's probably hard for like a regular person to know when they buy a product that something can be recycled. But definitely look for those 1s and 2s under the container. Those tend to get recycled the most. And so, if you are going to buy a product that, where you can't avoid for whatever reason, try to look for something that can be recycled and that you can recycle and put into the right place, so that it does have sort of a circular economy associated with it. So those would be the main things we can do as consumers of plastics.
Awesome. Well, Priyanka, thanks for joining us on the show. If people want to learn more about you or Renewology or Renew Oceans, where should they go?
Yeah, so you can follow both Renewology and Renew Oceans online. The websites are renewology.com and renewoceans.com, respectively. And all of the Twitter, Facebook, Instagram handles are also at Renewology and at Renew Oceans, respectively. So we're very easy to find online, and we definitely welcome you to follow us and join our journey and story.
Hey listener, have you ever wanted to get a message in front of the Upside audience but weren't sure how to sponsor this show or weren't able to do a long-term sponsorship? Well, now you can just go to upside.fm/classifieds and let our audience know anything that's going on in your world, whether it's an event, an application, a special coupon or deal, or just letting them know who you are, what your company does. All you have to do is go to upside.fm/classifieds and you can place an ad on this show. That's upside.fm/classifieds. All right, Eric, we just spoke with Priyanka of Renewology. You had to step out a little bit early, but I know you listened back through the recording. So what were your key takeaways to start the Deal Memo?
Well, my first takeaway was it took me right back to our conversation with Eric from Plus One Robotics, which probably isn't where you thought this Deal Memo would start.
It wasn't.
But Eric was talking about this idea of the sorted pile problem. And I had brought up on that interview the idea of his technology being applicable to sorting different types of plastics. And the reason that kind of popped up in my brain as we were talking through Renewology was the fact that this is a process that still relies on some semblance of kind of sorting your recycling, but does it in a chemical way. So I did a little bit of research, Jay, and I wanted to learn about chemical plastics recycling.
I love when you do that.
And what I found is that it seems to be taking off. And there's a business called Agilix, which breaks down something like 10 metric tons per day of some plastic waste that I'm not going to pretend that I can pronounce. There's a few others, and they're really there's so much demand for this recycling in a cost-effective way that doesn't compromise the end product, that I think this kind of movement of chemical recycling seems to be starting to hit its stride. And it seems like it's the early innings. I guess my biggest question when it comes to Renewology is if there are other companies doing this and doing this at larger scale. And again, I don't know if 10 tons is a large scale. It could be very small. But if there are other companies doing this, what is Renewology's secret sauce?
I'm glad you did that research. Admittedly, I spent a lot of time asking questions about the state of recycling and how this works, and didn't prioritize or save enough time to ask more questions about the business model of Renewology specifically. There was a lot about this interview that frustrated me, and it wasn't the way that Priyanka was answering things or the business itself. It's the systemic issue of, we have reason to believe this is working. We've been doing this since 2011. We can show some pretty awesome results, and we're getting held up by a lot of regulation and being able to fit within certain codes to create these facilities. Assuming that's all true, I hate when that happens. Where like we have a system and we have to check some boxes and we have to categorize things, and your innovation doesn't fit within that, so this whole thing slows down. And meanwhile, this is an actual planetary existential problem that your technology is trying to combat. Very frustrating to me in that way. So you ask about the secret sauce of Renewology versus some of these other chemical recycling businesses. The humanitarian in me is like, who cares? Get as many of these things going and like taking care of the problem as possible. But I don't have an answer for you for how their chemical process is different. But it did sound like they have the potential to make some good money on the actual outputs of the process that they're selling.
Well, if I'm thinking about the secret sauce, it doesn't have to be a better chemical process. It can be a good chemical process that does what it needs to do and does what it says it's going to do and outlays a good product that they can sell back to market. But I think that there is kind of something interesting happening in the venture space in general. And we're supposed to be, as we sit here in the deal memo, thinking as investors. So while you and I both think that the recycling problem specifically around plastics is real. I mean, I'm wearing a 4Ocean bracelet right now. I donate to them. Like I think that plastics in the oceans, plastics everywhere are getting really bad and only getting worse. The business side of this, I think that regulatory hurdles offer, if you can align your business in a way that they can get into those spaces, actually offer investors a lot of protection and a lot of potential growth opportunities. So right now, I think that you see in the venture space, people getting into things like fintech, which is one of the most highly regulated industries, or healthcare tech. Those are areas where venture capital probably would have stayed away from in the last, call it decade or so. But now there's this turn to saying, okay, we can take the expertise and connections we've made across industries and with high-ranking people and use regulation and our understanding of regulatory hurdles to actually create a really good investment where others can't. So if I'm thinking about Renewology as an investor with my investor hat on, I'm thinking, okay, there are regulatory hurdles and those are annoying, but if they can find a way to get through those regulatory hurdles with this product, then the upside is enormous.
Back to the titular line, I love it. She mentioned that financing the project as one of the constraints to scaling this, as is the constraint to so many businesses trying to scale. What I couldn't quite grasp is how Renew Oceans got off the ground and they created a facility that's testing that effort, because to me, that's some funding that can be used towards Renewology and scaling that. So there are a lot of questions that I still had coming out of this interview of where will the financing come from? Why can't we throw money at financing this and at legislation to get this permitted and regulated and, to your point, protected as sort of the incumbent technology to do this? So I have a hard time talking about this as an opportunity, as we typically do in the deal memo. But a couple key stats that stuck out to me just in general from this interview: 90% of plastic waste in the ocean coming from 10 key rivers is something I didn't know. She had a note about how much of that came from Asia that I seem to have misplaced, but it was far more responsibility on the US than I thought. But overall, learned a lot about how the current recycling process works here nationally and globally. I didn't know there were 7 different types of plastics and that 5 of them were low value. So learned a lot. Didn't get enough information here to do a proper deal memo, unfortunately.
No, but I don't think that means we can't think about the opportunity size and drivers globally. If we think about the US as the largest plastics polluter in the world, which is true, up until the beginning of 2019, China was buying a large majority of our plastics and just recycling in general. They've since stopped that since they want to have more original materials and not recycled materials, which means that there is now going to be a glut of plastics, non-recycled plastics, that are not going to be subsidized by a foreign entity or foreign country buying the US's plastics, which means that there's going to be a need to turn these plastics into something productive, or there's going to be a boom in landfills.
A real Wall-E situation, which I watched the first time on a plane recently.
Phenomenal movie.
So help me understand this. Eva. Help me understand this. So you said United States, the biggest plastic polluter in the world. Is that because we are manufacturing and disseminating the most plastic? Because she did say something about Asia being where most of this comes from, but maybe that's because that's just like the landing place of that plastic. Help me understand.
It's just something I read, that the United States produces the most plastic pollution. I guess it's up for debate, but as I understand it, we're the biggest consumer culture in the world, and a lot of our consumption revolves around plastics. That plastics goes into recycling bins, and that gets shipped to Asia, and then they recycle it and use it in their building materials or whatever. But that kind of value chain has stopped in 2019, and the value of plastics actually, or the price of plastics, hit a cliff after we had this China scrap ban. And I just did a little quick Google search to make sure I had the dates right. It turns out it's actually 2018, not 2019. So the years are moving faster and faster, Jay, and I'm forgetting when headlines are happening. But nonetheless, there is a global shift in the way plastics are being dealt with in the United States. And I think that if you went through a week and every plastic article you touched or were going to throw away, you put into a pile, you would be amazed at how much plastic you yourself use.
Shots fired. We want to shift our focus now to Priyanka as a founder.
Let's do it. I think this is the easiest one, right? I think we have a large opportunity that's changing that may provide a lot of opportunity for the business itself. We have some questions around the business model because we didn't ask the right questions. But then when you look at Priyanka as a founder, this is easy. She's brilliant, she's motivated, and she's passionate, and she obviously understands the space. So to me, checked a lot of boxes. What about for you?
I would agree with all of that. She's running into the difficulty of regulation, as a lot of founders do. So I think Priyanka as a founder is currently being and going to be tested by this challenge of, okay, I've run into a problem that is sort of outside of my control and outside of myself. What do I do to get through that? And I think that's going to be like a real measure on her success as a founder of how can I problem solve this, both the permitting challenges, but also the financing challenges. Now running this for-profit company and the nonprofit Renew Oceans, it seems like a place where there's a lot of probably shared political goodwill of finding solutions to this. So can she pull all that together and keep the lights on and keep things moving forward? But obviously brilliant, obviously very passionate about this. And, you know, we're all in Priyanka's corner on this, I think.
So I think you are alluded to it there, but what do you want to see from Priyanka and Renewology in the next 6 to 18 months?
Not only do we need to see a breakthrough in this permitting and regulation space, but you want to see it in such a way that it creates a playbook or a guidepost that you can continue to hand off to other cities, municipalities, and basically say, here's how we've done it in these places, and here's how it can be implemented, and make that process easier and shorter each time you go in and do this. That's what I'm looking for. Can we do that? And also, at the same time, this is cost intensive and financing was a struggle. So how are things going on the financing front?
I think you took both of the things I wanted to say. So I will add a third. I want to hear more about those conversations with additional municipalities. I want to hear about the business development and the perceived need, because I think this narrative in the US culture is only growing, but I want to see how that is translating to need from communities.
All right, dear listener, we'd love to hear what you think about Renewology and this interview with Priyanka. You can tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm, and we'll talk to you next week.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's guest, so shoot us an email at hello@upside.fm or find us on Twitter @UpsideFM. We'll be back here next week at the same time talking to another founder in our quest to find upside outside of Silicon Valley. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please email us or find us on Twitter and let us know. And if you love our show, please leave us a review on iTunes. That goes a long way in helping us spread the word and continue to help bring high-quality guests to the show. Eric and I decided there were a couple things we wanted to share with you at the end of the podcast, and so here we go. Eric Hornung and Jay Klaus are the founding parties of the Upside podcast. At the time of this recording, we do not own equity or other financial interest in the companies which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinions of Duff & Phelps LLC and its affiliates, Unreal Collective LLC and its affiliates, or any entity which employ us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We have not considered your specific financial situation nor provided any investment advice on this show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Never mind, bro, that can't be matched. I'm lighting it on fire, used to run victory laps, and still I'm not even tired. It's all about the timing, yeah, that's what they say. Well, I'ma keep on